Ah, yes, vehicle price. This is always kind of a sticky situation when it comes to startups because making an automotive company profitable is difficult in itself. Then making an all-electric automotive brand is even more challenging in that. Then you throw in that investors are a little bit more cautious towards investment these days than they used to be, and you get the sticky mess that Aptera is in right now, where you're negotiating with suppliers and you're probably getting different prices for large quantities and small quantities to try to figure out what the lowest possible price is for your vehicle that you can get, but you also still need to be able to sell it at a price your customer's comfortable with, and also still bring in enough profit to ensure the company doesn't go bankrupt. Now, I assure you, Aptera's ethos and company philosophy is all surrounded around efficiency, and with that, they want to make sure that they can use the smallest possible battery pack to achieve the most amount of range, purely because they want EVs to be more affordable. They don't want you to have to pay six figures in order to go great distances on a charge, and that's why affordability is key and important to them. But you also have to remember, at the end of the day, this is a young startup company, and if you're not profitable and you sell your vehicles for way too cheap that you go out of business, then you're not really able to achieve your mission statement. You're not able to deliver on the long-term goal of making more affordable vehicles and having multiple trim options that fit whatever your customer base is in the market for. So I'm just trying to preface this whole video by saying this is a tricky subject, okay? Aptera is not going to raise prices purely because of corporate greed. We need to make more money. This is about the state of the company and the health of the business. And it should be mentioned that not all companies can be as lucky as Rivian and have billions and billions of dollars of cash worthy to burn just to make their customers happy all the time. Of course, there's a sweet spot, there's a fulcrum point that they have to find between what the price of manufacturing the vehicle is and what their customers are willing to pay. And because they're a young startup company, personally, I think we as a community need to be a little bit more chill and understanding of this tricky predicament that they find themselves in. I don't think it's necessarily fair just to compare their first launch edition vehicle prices directly to what's already been on the market, what's been in production for 8 years, and say, why can't it be cheaper than that? Because there's a lot of new technology going into these first launch edition models. It's a brand new company. But even so, the main reason I want to talk about Aptera price is because of a slide that Steve from Aptera Owners Club recently shared on his channel from a presentation with US Capital Global, who's helping them fund their path towards production. And again, it's very likely that a lot of this data has changed because it's a several month old presentation slide. We know that battery prices have been following, so this could of course be changed, especially based on how the community reacts to it and that kind of thing. But in this one slide talking about the bill of materials of the Aptera coming in a little bit below $30,000, at least right now, we see the MSRP listed at $39,000. Now, of course, that is quite a bit higher than the initial launch edition price, which was supposed to be more like $33,000. And I saw a lot of comments on that video saying like, oh god, if Aptera gets any more expensive, then I'm not considering it. But what killed me the most about reading a lot of these comments from the Aptera community is that they are not factoring in the cost of ownership, which in my opinion you absolutely have to factor in when talking about a vehicle, because we don't buy these things for them to just sit in our yards doing nothing. And there's so many more variables that go into the price of ownership with any kind of automotive transport, really, that people are just throwing out the whole efficiency argument out the window as soon as they see that sticker price, even though most people these days are financing their vehicles anyway. So I did some rough napkin math for today's video that I hope could shed some light on how the Aptera may not be as expensive as a lot of people think, with the context that yes, that launch edition being $39,000 is not a guaranteed lock-in. It could be different. It may have changed by the time they developed this presentation. But still, let's just assume it's accurate and they just haven't gotten around to announcing it yet. And even for the accelerators and everything, the first few thousand Aptera are going to be around $39,000. Okay, let's just assume that is correct and compare that to another very popular EV, in my opinion, probably the closest EV on the market to the Aptera, the long-range rear-wheel drive Model 3. Of course, because there's no belly pan cooling and they're probably not going with the hub motors, I'm going to round down for the sake of this argument and just assume for the sake of the argument that the Aptera is not going to hit 10 miles per kilowatt hour. Let's just say it hits 8, okay? So there's a 20% range hit simply because it's the launch edition and it doesn't have a heat pump quite yet, so there's some other efficiency things that they're going to figure out down the road. But let's just refer to the launch edition here, and that rear-wheel drive long-range Model 3 that's on the market starts before incentives at about $42,500. $4,500. Obviously, if you qualify for the federal tax credit, that price is much lower, but depending on who wins the election, that tax credit may go away. Not to mention, pretty much all the Aptera that are going to be starting in that launch edition pricing are going to be for the accelerators, and I think there's a pretty decent chance that a lot of people on the accelerator program don't qualify for the federal tax credit because they had enough spare change to pour, several tens of thousands of dollars into Aptera stock. But even so, MSRP, we're just going to say, is pretty much in the same ballpark as the Aptera. Model 3 gets around 4.5 miles per kilowatt hour, and I'm going to round down on the solar charging as well. And let's just say that instead of getting the up to 4 kilowatt hours a day, let's say on average, because there's some cloudier days in the year, your launch edition Aptera only clocks in about 2 kilowatt hours a day. Okay, so that brings in about 730 kilowatt hours per year of free energy that you would not find on the Model 3. And if we're assuming 8 miles per kilowatt hour from the Aptera, and for the sake of this argument, we're going to say both the Model 3 and the Aptera on average are driving about 15,000 miles per year. Okay, it's a little bit higher than the US national average, but the national average has been continuing, and we're talking about the length of ownership of the vehicle, so I just kept it simple for the math and said 15,000 miles a year. Well, with that math, it takes the Aptera a little under 1,900 kilowatt hours per year to drive around, but keep in mind, 730 kilowatt hours come in for free from the sun, which means the only kilowatt hours you would actually have to pay for would be around 1,100, which, as you're about to see, is substantially less than the Model 3. The Model 3 is still a very great, very reasonable EV out there, but still clocking in about 4.5 miles per kilowatt hour, and with no solar charging, that means you're consuming over 3,300 kilowatt hours per year in the Model 3. So when we're factoring in the cost of ownership here, it's a tricky debate to figure out exactly what we should estimate the price per kilowatt hour is, mainly because the price of electricity has gone up a lot and will probably continue to go up over the next decade. And also there's home electricity rates, there's on-peak and off-peak, plus there's DC fast charging rates, which mean you're not always paying off-peak power for your electricity. Sometimes you're paying 40 or 50 cents a kilowatt hour if you're on a road trip. So the rough average I came up with for the sake of this example is around 35 cents per kilowatt hour. I think that's a safe bet because it's what my off-peak electricity costs where I live. I'm sure it'll go up over the course of 8 years, which is on average how long people own a vehicle for. And I know most people are not paying that for their off-peak electricity, but you're also going to be paying probably more than 35 cents a kilowatt hour when you're DC fast charging, particularly the next few years. So I thought 35 cents would be a fair assumption, and then that brings the Aptera cost to charge every single year to about $400. Again, that's with my generous 8 miles per kilowatt hour and only 2 kilowatt hours coming in per day. The solar efficiency might actually be much better if you're in a sunnier climate, but I'm trying to be reasonable and fair for the sake of the argument. Whereas the Model 3 would cost you over $1,100 in electricity per year. So after 8 years of ownership, which is on average how long people own a vehicle, the Model 3 is looking at over $9,000 just to charge the thing. Still a lot less than paying for gasoline though, that's for sure. Whereas the Aptera is looking at just over $3,000 in electricity prices after 8 years of ownership. So we've got a $6,000 price difference when we factor in over the life of the vehicle how much money you're actually saving on electricity and energy by driving an Aptera. On top of that, I think there's also a convenience factor that should be considered, that the Aptera is able to charge itself in sunlight. That means less having to worry about having a great home charging solution. A Tesla, if you want to charge it quickly overnight, you're going to want a higher amperage NEMA 1450 outlet. Not all houses have that available to them. Not everybody has a garage they can park their EV and plug into. But with the Aptera, you can charge it off of any old 110 outlet, which is much easier to come by. You can leave it outside. In fact, it's preferable to leave it out in your driveway so it can charge itself. Plus, even when you drive it to work, it can be passively charging from sunlight. I think there's a convenience argument there that really isn't going to be present in the Model 3, which, assuming the Aptera only gets 8 miles per kilowatt hour, that's more like a 350 mile range, which puts it in par with what the long-range Model 3 would achieve anyway. So again, about the same starting price, about the same range, but the Aptera has a bit more of a convenience when it comes to the charging accessibility, and also is much, much cheaper to run over the long haul. And that's not even factoring in other costs of ownership, like vehicle registration. The Aptera, being an autocycle, means it doesn't have to pay a lot of those expensive registration costs that a four-wheeled car on paper has to pay. There's higher road maintenance fees with EV registration. Like my Model 3 is costing me over $600 a year in California to register, whereas the Aptera, we don't know exactly because because it's an auto cycle and it hasn't been registered by the DMV yet, but has a different set of requirements, different set of codes, very likely to cost about half of that, maybe $200, $300 a year in registration. And also, we haven't even factored in tire maintenance. The Aptera has smaller, cheaper, thinner tires, not to mention there's only 3 of them, whereas of course you hit a pothole in the Model 3, don't ask me how I know, but damaging those rims in those tires can be a lot more expensive to replace on a Tesla, because now you gotta replace all 4 tires, and they're much wider, they're much fancier tires. So I think there's other things that may stack up over the course of 8 years that the Aptera could easily end up being much cheaper to own than a Tesla Model 3. I'm not trying to say that one is necessarily the right choice and one is the bad choice, but if you're an Aptera fan, I already know you're an enthusiast. You're following a startup company, you were willing to put down a deposit on a vehicle that is not out yet, that you haven't driven around yet, and I know there's some of you out there just saying, well yeah Drew, but the Model 3, it can seat 5. Well, if you really needed a 5-seater, the Aptera was never really up for debate then. If having a second row of seats is that important to you, I don't know why we're even having this discussion. It's obvious that the Aptera was always meant to be a 2-seater. It's meant to be good for single people or couples, or it's the parents' weekend getaway car, it's the commuter. It's meant to get you to work and back really efficiently. It's not meant to be the family car that everybody piles into, in which case, yeah, obviously the Model 3 is the only choice if you just need more occupants, but try to think a little bit about the future of the company and how if they price this vehicle too low, there's a decent chance we're never going to have adequate solar mobility, and we're going to continue having to buy vehicles from the big well-known EV makers that don't want to have CarPlay, that don't want to support right to repair, and aren't interested in passively charging the vehicle with state-of-the-art solar technology. Yeah, you can be like everybody else on the road or everybody else in the EV community and just buy a Tesla. It's a very safe route. It's already proven. They've got service centers and stuff. I wish you all the best, and I think Tesla's going to be around for a long, long time, but we're on the cusp of, I think, a revolution when it comes to electrification, and I think there's a lot of untapped potential when it comes to efficiency that can be achieved by a radically rethought exterior, having something so aerodynamic that can still be safe, and also having a young startup that's willing to be engaged with their community, listen to the customers' demands, integrate solar technology so that it can be passively charging itself. So yeah, the launch editions might end up being a bit more expensive than we all like. Don't get me wrong, I wish that everybody could just drive around an Aptera for free. That's a happy, lucky world we could all be in, but especially if you start cross-shopping the Aptera with gas vehicles or plug-in hybrids, yeah, the cost savings over the course of 8 years start to become even more astronomical because of the price of gasoline being so absurdly high these days. So I still think even with a higher sticker price, the Aptera would be cheaper in the long run, but even if it wasn't, my point is at the end of the day that other startups like Tesla out there started with $100,000 vehicles and worked their way down to $80,000 vehicles, and then a few years down the road, they started selling $50,000 vehicles, and Rivian, they started also with $70,000, $80,000 vehicles. Lucid started with $150,000 vehicles, and Rivian and Lucid are still having a very hard time turning a profit, and here we have an efficiency-focused startup like Aptera that's not trying to just make another generic SUV like we already have on the road today. They're trying really hard to radically rethink how efficient vehicles can be. They want the long range with the low price. They want it to be passively charged by sunlight, and here they are facing a bunch of backlash from their community for wanting their first vehicle to be $40,000, substantially lower than any other startup out there, and honestly, I think they are going to make it work. I think that they're securing the funding they need from US Capital Global, and they're doing everything they can to keep the community happy, but let's try to meet them in the middle a little bit, guys, because it's very, very easy for these startups to go under, okay? It's very difficult to turn these young companies profitable, and they kind of need a bit of passion and maybe a little bit of a, what do you call it, Aptera tax from the community that we're willing to pay, simply because they're a new company and we want them to succeed in the long run. We want them to be able to make more vehicles down the road that do sit more people, or cheaper versions of the Aptera that maybe have smaller battery packs, but even lower weight, even lower prices, so that there's more options out there for people who want to go all electric. Personally, I think the Aptera would absolutely still be worth it at $40,000, and I wish them all the best, and I hope the community can be understanding of the difficult predicament they're in. What do you guys think? Am I terribly wrong? Are you putting your foot down? Feel free to drop your thoughts down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos, so thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.